Since I was a kid, I learned to count coins before spending a single cent. I grew up watching my mother juggle odd jobs, trying to keep the bills in check, while my father vanished into long work hours and lost nights at the bar. When he left us for good, the debt we inherited was a cruel gift. Now, in my early 30s, I find myself trapped in the same trap, jumping from job to job, always trying to keep my head above water. Last month was particularly tough. The company I worked for cut staff without warning, and I was one of the first to be let go. With rent overdue and a utility bill on the brink of being shut off, I started selling everything I could. The old laptop, the branded sneakers a friend gave me, even a watch inherited from my grandfather. But the money always evaporated too quickly. It was in this desperation that I started looking for secondhand stores, places where I could buy something cheap and perhaps resell it for a better price. That's when I found that shop. I had never heard of it before, which was strange because I had already scoured almost every pawn shop and thrift store in town. But there it was, tucked between two abandoned buildings, a low structure suffocated by worn-out signs. The plaque in front was faded, the letters worn to the point of being nearly unreadable. Only a short and enigmatic name remained visible, Atroka. When I walked in, a bell above the door rang with a hollow, weak sound, as if it were tired. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the expected musty or dusty odor, but something damp and slightly metallic, like rusted iron mixed with aged leather. The place was dimly lit, with weak lamps hanging from crooked wires on the ceiling. The shelves were dark wood, warped by time, packed with objects of all sorts, small sculptures of twisted faces, rusted music boxes, stained mirrors, and hardcover books with no visible titles. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked between the rows of shelves, each seeming to tell a forgotten story. I felt a weight in the air, as if something invisible was watching my every move. Then I saw the salesman. He was behind the counter, partly hidden in the shadows. A tall, slender man with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent under the dim lighting. His eyes were deep, so dark they looked empty. He wore an old-fashioned black suit with an embroidered handkerchief peeking out of his breast pocket. But what unsettled me the most was his smile. It wasn't a smile of courtesy or friendliness. It was narrow, fixed, as if it were just a mask stretched over his thin face. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, raspy, as if it came from far away. I hesitated for a moment. Something about him made me uncomfortable, but at the same time, an unsettling curiosity made me want to explore more. I took a deep breath and decided to ignore the feeling that I might be in the wrong place. After all, I needed something cheap to resell, and that place seemed like a treasure chest of forgotten items. "I'm looking for something special." The man tilted his head slightly, his smile widening. "We only deal in special items here. Nothing here is ordinary." He slid one of his thin hands over the counter. "But everything has a price." The way he said that sent a chill down my spine. There was a weight to his words, something that seemed much deeper than a simple commercial transaction. I forced a smile, trying to ease the growing tension. "Well, I'm looking for something valuable, but that I can get for a good price." The salesman looked at me for a long moment, as if assessing me carefully. His smile didn't fade, but his eyes seemed to glow in the shop's dim light. "I have something for you," he said, turning to one of the shelves behind the counter. His long, skeletal arm reached out for an old wooden box, covered with a thin layer of dust. He pulled it slowly and placed it on the counter in front of me. The box was small, about the size of a thick book, with strange carvings on its surface. Geometric patterns I didn't immediately recognize, but that caused a slight discomfort when I looked at them. "This," he said, giving a small tap on the lid of the box, "belonged to someone who no longer needs it." I swallowed hard. Something in the way he phrased it unsettled me, but I attributed it to fatigue and the heavy atmosphere of the store. I needed something valuable to resell, and this seemed like a curious piece, maybe rare. "What is this?" I asked, running my fingers over the rough lid. The touch of the wood gave me a strange sensation, as if there was a faint vibration under the surface. "An ancient relic, and let's say unique." The salesman smiled, showing thin, perfectly aligned teeth. "You can take it for a symbolic price. Let's say $20. I frowned. That was far too little for something that seemed so old. Even if it were just a decorative item, I could easily resell it for 10 times that amount. Is that all? I asked, suspicious. That's it. The seller crossed his hands over the counter, his long, thin fingers resting like inert spiders. Consider it an unexpected stroke of luck. Something told me to refuse, but need spoke louder. I needed the money, and this seemed like an easy opportunity. I pulled out my wallet and handed him a crumpled bill. He accepted the payment with cold fingers and pushed the box toward me with a nearly ceremonial gesture. I hope you make good use of it, he murmured as I put the purchase in my backpack. The bell rang again when I left the store, and I felt an instant relief as I stepped onto the cold street. The air felt lighter, as though I had left a place where the very atmosphere tried to trap me. I looked back, and the shop seemed even darker, sunken in the shadow between the buildings. For a moment, I thought the letters on the sign had shifted slightly, but maybe it was just my imagination. Back at my small apartment, I placed the box on the table and sat down to examine it more closely. The dim light from the lamp cast irregular shadows over the carved wood. The symbols etched into it seemed even more intricate under the light, and for a moment, I almost believed they had moved slightly. I shook my head and laughed at myself. This will make good money, I thought, opening the box. Inside, resting on a worn black velvet lining, was a peculiar object. It was a small metal statuette of a beautiful little ballerina. Holding it, I felt a slight chill running up my arms. An involuntary shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered once before stabilizing. My heart beat faster, but I forced myself to ignore it. It was probably just an electrical issue. I placed the statuette back in the box and stood up to get a glass of water. While I drank, I had the impression of hearing a soft sound, almost a sigh, coming from the table. I quickly glanced back, but everything was in the same place. My mind must have been playing tricks on me. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The apartment seemed quieter than usual, but every so often, I heard small creaks coming from the direction of the table where I had left the box. When I finally managed to fall asleep, a strange dream enveloped me. I was in a dark hallway, the walls covered in symbols similar to those on the box. A whisper echoed around me, words indecipherable in a language I didn't recognize. At the end of the hall, the statuette was on the ground, facing me as if watching me. When I took a step toward it, it moved slightly. I woke up in a cold sweat. The clock read 3 in the morning. I turned to the other side, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. It was just a dream, nothing more. But the next morning, when I looked at the box, I noticed the lid was slightly open. I was absolutely sure I had closed it before going to sleep. The following days were strange. Small incidents started happening around me. The lights flickered inexplicably. Shadows seemed to move at the corner of my vision, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, there was always a muffled sound of something scraping against the wood of the box where the beautiful ballerina was kept. However, my luck seemed to be changing. I posted pictures of the item in some collectors groups, and the response was almost immediate. A message appeared from an anonymous profile, offering an absurd amount of money for the ballerina. The buyer insisted the delivery be made at a private and discreet location. On the agreed day, I went to a sleek apartment downtown. The buyer, a man impeccably dressed, seemed fascinated by the ballerina even before touching it. His eyes shone in an unusual way as he held it, as if he were hypnotized. He paid me without questioning, and for the first time in months, I felt genuine financial relief. But as I left the building, a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong, but I couldn't identify what. The idea of returning to the mysterious shop came almost automatically. After all, if one item had brought me so much money, why not try again? This time, the seller seemed to be waiting for me. His thin smile widened when I entered, and he moved with a supernatural calm. "Ready for another relic?" he asked, already pulling another box from a high shelf. This time, the item was a small mirror with a golden frame. Something in the surface reflected strangely, as if the image inside took a millisecond longer to match my movements. "The same price," he said, pushing the mirror toward me. This time, I hesitated. The bad feeling returned every time I held one of the objects from this shop. But the money? The money was too good to refuse. Again, I sold the item quickly. The buyer was amazed. His eyes seemed to glow when he touched the mirror, just like the man who bought the ballerina. The routine repeated itself. I would buy an item, feel strange bringing it home, but always find a fascinated buyer who would pay absurd amounts. An old music box, a cracked porcelain mask, a pocket watch that never seemed to mark the same time for too long. They were all sold with ease, and my bank account flourished. But with each new purchase, I slept worse. Restless dreams filled my nights, full of whispers, indistinct shapes, and the constant feeling of being watched. Then came the new visit to the store. As soon as I entered, the seller was already holding something for me. This time, a black ring, shiny and perfectly fitting to my finger. "This one will be special," he murmured as I closed the deal. When I left for the first time, I looked back. The shop seemed darker than ever, as if it was sinking into the shadows of its very existence. And this time, as I held the ring on my way home, the strange feeling didn't fade. On the contrary, it seemed to grow. With every step I took toward home, the weight of the ring on my finger became more intense, as if it had a life of its own. Its black, unusual, and fascinating glow seemed to pulse, as though it was adapting to my skin. Somehow, it drew me in, yet at the same time, it repelled me. It was an uncomfortable sensation, as if I were being consumed by something I couldn't understand. When I got home, I threw the key on the table and went straight to the mirror. I looked at the ring, examining it more closely. It was simple, yet at the same time, so imposing that it seemed to have a presence of its own. The black stone in the center reflected light in a strange way, distorting everything around it, as if it were warping reality. That's when I noticed something peculiar. Engraved in small details around the ring, there was a pattern that seemed vaguely familiar. It wasn't just a decorative design, but a specific symbol, the same one I had seen on the box, more specifically on the hand of the man I had handed the box to. There was no mistake. The ring belonged to that man. It was a detail I hadn't paid much attention to at the time, but now it flooded my memory. The ring belonged to him, the man who had bought the first item. There was no doubt. And the feeling I had with the ring was exactly the same as the one I had when handing the box to that man. The feeling that now consumed me was completely different. The ring was not just another strange item in my collection. It carried with it the energy of someone who had already been touched by that store, by those objects. And that didn't seem right. My mind started to spin, filled with questions I couldn't answer. What was happening? Why were these objects, which seemed so innocent at first, beginning to affect me so profoundly? And more importantly, what was that ring? Who had created it? I was overcome by an unbearable need to confront the seller. I needed to know the truth. I had to understand what was happening, what was drawing me to these objects, this place, and now, this ring. That night, I decided I would return to the shop. I didn't know exactly what I would find, but something inside me told me I needed to see the seller again. Something was calling me there. On the way to the store, the ring seemed even heavier, as if it were pulling me toward an unknown destiny. The path that once felt so familiar now stretched before me like a dark tunnel, and the feeling of being watched intensified with every step I took. Fear mixed with curiosity, creating a toxic blend of emotions that left me restless. But I had to keep going. I reached the street where the store should have been, but something was wrong. Where there had once been the door to the store, now there was only a brick wall. The building that had once occupied that place, with its dusty windows and decaying facade, had disappeared, replaced by a smooth wall with no indication that anything had ever been there. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. This didn't make sense. I was sure the store had been there. I remembered it clearly, but now it was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just an illusion, that I might be dreaming or delirious, but the reality before me was inescapable. I was there, in front of the wall that had once led to the dark store, and it was empty. I was overcome by a frantic impulse and began searching around, touching the walls, trying to find any trace of the shop where I had bought all those objects. I felt desperate, almost frantic, as if what was at stake was much more than mere curiosity. Then I saw something on the ground, something that caught my attention. A torn piece of paper lay fallen, and as I bent down to pick it up, I recognized the handwriting. It was the same handwriting as the seller's. The piece of paper was covered in symbols, all the same as those that had marked the items I'd bought, including the symbol of the dancer on the ring. But there was more. In the center of the paper, a single sentence was written: "Thank you very much for your collecting service." I stood still for a moment, trying to process what that sentence meant. What did it mean? What was I collecting? What did the seller mean by that? A cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked at the ring on my finger, and I could almost hear screams of desperation coming from within it. Fear turned to terror, and I began to understand what was happening. I wasn't just buying and selling objects. I was collecting souls, the souls of everyone who had bought my pieces. Each object I sold, every item I exchanged for money, was taking a part of someone. And the ring, the last of these items, was the soul of that man. The store had never existed, or at least not in the way I imagined. I couldn't understand how it all had started. There was no logical explanation, no clear reason for what was happening. But one thing I knew for certain: that seller, the macabre and mysterious man in that shop, was death. Death, in its purest and most disguised form, playing with the lives of others like a game. The worst part is not knowing if I was just a pawn in his game, or if I was another target. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.